Moscow, January 31st, 1990. Pushkin Square, hours before sunrise, and people are already lining up. By the time the doors opened at 10 that morning, more than 30,000 people were waiting. Some sources say closer to 38,000. Not for bread, not for medicine, not for a signature on a government form, for a hamburger. It broke the McDonald's single-day attendance record by a staggering margin. The previous record, set in Budapest, stood at just over 9,000 customers. Moscow tripled it before lunch. It was the first McDonald's in the Soviet Union, the largest McDonald's on Earth. And when those golden arches lit up over Pushkin's statue, something in the Iron Curtain gave way. Not with a treaty, not with a tank, but with a sesame seed bun. To understand why a hamburger could do that, you first have to understand what eating out actually meant in the Soviet Union. Most restaurants were state-owned. The food was inconsistent. The service was, by wide reputation, hostile. A simple meal could take 2 hours, not because the kitchen was overwhelmed, but because nobody working there had any particular reason to hurry. There was no competition, no incentive, no consequence for indifference. If you didn't like the service, there was nowhere else to go. Think about that for a second. An entire country where customer service, as most of the world understood the phrase, essentially didn't exist as a concept. A waiter had no reason to hurry because a happier customer brought him nothing extra, and an unhappy one cost him nothing either. The entire relationship between a business and the person standing in front of it had simply been switched off. This is the story of how one hamburger chain spent 14 years, $50 million, and an entire agricultural supply chain built from nothing, just to prove that something as ordinary as a smile and a fast, clean meal could shake a superpower. The story begins 14 years earlier at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. George Cohan, the head of McDonald's Canada, struck up a conversation with a Soviet official in the stands. It was casual, almost nothing, and it turned into 14 years of negotiation, longer than the Second World War lasted for one restaurant. The Soviet Union simply had no supply chain that could support a McDonald's, so McDonald's built one itself. It imported russet potato seed and taught Soviet farmers how to grow it. It brought in Dutch cattle to improve the beef stock. It built greenhouses for lettuce that could meet its standards, and a 100,000 square foot production plant outside Moscow, nicknamed McComplex, to bake the buns and process the meat. And no, this is not something anyone made up for effect. Even after all that domestic investment, the restaurant still imported a large share of its remaining supplies from abroad in the early years, simply because so little in the Soviet system could meet a consistent standard. It was one of the only places in Moscow that never seemed to run out of food. To open at all, McDonald's had to accept something no Western company usually would. The Moscow city government held 51% ownership of the joint venture. McDonald's Canada held the rest and ran daily operations. A restaurant, majority owned by a communist city council, serving the most recognizable symbol of American capitalism on the planet. The restaurant accepted rubles only, a deliberate choice. Cohan later explained that pricing it in hard foreign currency would have shut out nearly the entire Soviet population, and that wasn't the point of coming at all. More than 35,000 people applied for jobs at that single restaurant. About 600 were hired, mostly students from top universities, chosen partly for language skills, partly for something harder to teach: the ability to look a stranger in the eye and smile like they meant it. One of those original hires later told an interviewer she'd been asked, point blank, whether she could smile for 8 straight hours. She said yes. She said it turned out to be much harder than it sounded. On opening morning, the restaurant expected to serve maybe 10,000 meals. It served over 30,000. Cohan had the first 50 customers served be children. Boris Yeltsin, not yet president, but already a rising political figure, showed up in the crowd. A Big Mac cost 3 rubles. For context, a full sit-down meal for one person could run 7 or 8 rubles, roughly half a day's average wage for many Soviet workers at the time. One customer, interviewed on camera that day, summed up the experience in 6 honest words. "It's very beautiful, but I expected more." Another woman admitted she wasn't entirely sure what she'd just eaten, only that it was, in her words, unusual and delicious. Somewhere in that crowd, unnoticed at the time, stood a young British diver named Jason Statham in Moscow for a competition, decades away from Hollywood. He'd heard about the opening and didn't want to miss it. Customers who did make it inside sometimes kept their paper wrappers and cups afterward, not as litter but as souvenirs. Small proof sitting on a shelf at home that the day had actually happened. Here's how the whole thing actually kept running, day after day in a country famous for running out of everything. The Soviet economy worked on centralized planning and unreliable delivery. McDonald's simply refused to plug into it. It built its own farms, its own processing plant, its own delivery trucks, its own quality inspectors, an entire miniature Western economy operating in parallel inside a system that couldn't reliably stock bread. That parallel system is the real reason the lines never really stopped, even after the novelty wore off. It wasn't just that the burger tasted like the one in Chicago. It was that the restaurant simply never seemed to run dry. A kind of reliability most Soviet citizens had never experienced from anything, let alone a sandwich. None of it was cheap to keep running. For years, industry reporting suggested the Moscow operation lost money on a per-meal basis, even as it broke attendance records. Proof that this was never conceived as a quick, profitable venture, but as a long, patient bet on what the country might eventually become. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Not for the customers, but for the idea itself. Hardline members of the Communist Party saw the Golden Arches as exactly what they were built to represent: an opening, a foothold. Soviet ideology had spent 70 years insisting that Western consumer culture was hollow, exploitative, a trap. Now it was sitting on Pushkin Square, drawing bigger crowds than any party rally in living memory. There wasn't much the government could do about it. The state needed foreign investment and international goodwill far more than it needed ideological purity, and it knew it. A joint venture majority owned by a Soviet city council was, technically, still a communist enterprise. In practice, it was being run, smoothly, efficiently, profitably, by capitalists. That contradiction, sitting quietly on a plate of fries, was the Soviet Union in miniature by 1990. A system that had stopped fully believing its own story. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe. There's a lot more behind this curtain. And yet, reduce this to a story about hamburgers, and you miss what was actually being sold. What nobody fully appreciated, watching from outside, was that almost nobody in that line was there purely for the food. A Big Mac cost roughly a quarter of an average day's wage. People were not lining up for 6 hours in the cold because they were hungry for beef. A retired Army veteran, interviewed decades later, put it simply: McDonald's made the world feel wider. For a few minutes, standing at that counter, ordering in rubles, eating something that tasted exactly like it did in Chicago or Toronto, you weren't quite a Soviet citizen anymore. You were just a person eating lunch in a version of the world that had, until that morning, only existed in rumor. A young customer put a sharper point on the same feeling, telling a camera crew, half joking, "They say the West is bad, but I like this food." It wasn't ideology winning an argument. It was one plain, ordinary lunch quietly outperforming decades of speeches about what the West was supposed to be. Less than 2 years after that first Big Mac, the Soviet Union itself was gone. The Golden Arches outlasted the hammer and sickle. That original 51% stake, still legally held by the Moscow city government, might have gone to the restaurant's own workers under Russia's new privatization rules. But the paperwork moved slowly, and by February 1996, McDonald's had simply bought 31% of the city's shares outright, bringing its own ownership up to 80%. The communist city council that once controlled the venture ended up, within 6 years, holding a minority stake in its own capital's most famous restaurant. Over the following 3 decades, McDonald's expanded to more than 850 locations across Russia and gradually shifted almost its entire supply chain onto domestic Russian producers. By some accounts, more than 90% locally sourced by the chain's 30th anniversary in 2020. The company that had once had to teach Soviet farmers how to grow the right potato eventually became, functionally, a Russian company in almost every respect except its name. But a bridge once built can be walked in both directions. And in May 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, McDonald's announced it was leaving the country for good. The reaction from Russia's own government was almost gleeful. The Speaker of the State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, told Parliament, "They announced that they are closing." Well, okay, close. Tomorrow there won't be McDonald's, but Uncle Vanya's, a jab that briefly and seriously produced a trademark filing for a restaurant chain with a sideways golden arch. Not every reaction was so cheerful. When the closure was first announced back in March, one man handcuffed himself to the door of a Moscow McDonald's in protest, telling onlookers the company's departure felt like an act of hostility in itself. 850 restaurants, roughly 62,000 employees. 32 years of history sold within weeks to Alexander Gover, a Siberian businessman who had already run 25 McDonald's franchises of his own. The condition of the sale was that he keep the entire workforce. He did. The restaurant on Pushkin Square never actually closed. It just changed its name to Vkusno I Tochka. Tasty, and that's it. Same building, reconstructed and expanded, once already back in 1989 to fit crowds nobody quite believed would come. Same fries, more or less. A different flag flying over the counter. A Hamburger opened a door in 1990 that 1,000 diplomatic cables couldn't manage. A Hamburger, in its own quiet way, closed one again in 2022. Neither event was really about the sandwich. Both were about what people were willing to stand in the cold for. Proof once that another kind of life existed just past the border. The queue outside Pushkin Square went quiet decades ago. But the question it first asked, how much of the world is actually within reach, never really did. Hit subscribe now so the next story from behind the Iron Curtain lands in front of you the moment it's out. There's a new one coming very soon, and you won't want to miss it. Somewhere behind every headline about empires and ideology, there's a smaller story about ordinary people and what they were willing to queue for in the cold. And those are always the ones worth telling properly.